Hello everyone and welcome to this part of the European Border Guard Day. And the issue for this panel is the new role of the Frontex in the Coast Guard functions. I am Dan Troell. I'm Director of International Affairs of the Swedish Coast Guard. Been quite a while in the Coast Guard, since 1975, when I came from the Navy to the Coast Guard. Have different types of positions during this trip until today here. I'm going to speak shortly during this session, but primarily it will be the panelists who will give presentations according to their specialties. And from your very right, from my very left, we have... Please.
Okay, I'm Ana Cristina Jorge. I'm currently the head of Joint Operations Unit in Frontex. Do you want me to elaborate a little bit on my CV? Yeah, okay. So I worked for more than 20 years in the Portuguese Immigration and Border Service. In 2009, I started to work directly with Frontex. I was for 3 years the liaison officer of the agency in Brussels, and since 2012, heading the Joint Operations Unit, in the beginning with the air, sea and land border sector and also return, and since more than 1 year ago, as you know, return, due to the relevance that it gained inside the agency, became an independent unit, so currently working with the 3 types of borders.
And to my left?
I'm Juan Santos Vara, professor of Public International Law and European Law at the University of Salamanca, where I hold a Jean Monnet chair. I've been researching in this field for several years. I would like also to point out that I've been involved in developing the European Joint Masters in Strategic Border Management almost since the beginning, and I've been also part of the teaching staff of this Frontex program. And we had last week in Salamanca the graduation of the first iteration of the Masters, which is a very, very ambitious project developed by Frontex.
Okay, and last but not least, to my right.
One more. Yes, my name is Patrick Augier. I am a rear admiral in the French Navy. I have been serving as Deputy Secretary General for the Sea for the Prime Minister. In France, we have a Coast Guard function, which is commanded by the Secretary General for the Sea for the Prime Minister, and has been in charge of all of that. So I've been serving at sea for more than 20 years in all parts in the world, and I've been serving too as a Prime Minister advisor for the sea.
Thank you. We will continue to around 1 o'clock when we have lunch. So the plan is to we have speeches on 10-15 minutes, and there we have spare time for questions from you before we end up this panel. I've been asked to moderate this panel, most likely because the Swedish Coast Guard represents one of the different Coast Guard organizations in Europe today. One of the solutions that you can find quite many differences of in the European Union. The Swedish Coast Guard is one of the oldest, by the way. It was created in 1638. If not the oldest, one of the oldest. And from the beginning, we were actually a multitasking organization, multipurpose operations organization, and has been so for all these years, and that has been developed. So Coast Guard officer today is not a policeman, is not a custom officer, is not a fishery inspector. He's the Coast Guard officer with the authority of a policeman, with the authority of a custom officer, and so on. In all the different areas of Coast Guarding, Coast Guard functions that you can find in Europe today. One of the problems when we started up, one of the different forums where we discussed Coast Guard issues where we exchange information and experience. The European Coast Guard Function Fora, as it's named today, was to define which type of organization should be involved in that cooperation. And that when we, around 2009, 2010, came up with the idea of talking about Coast Guard functions, not Coast Guard organizations, because they could be named Navy, they could be named Coast Guard, they could be named Border Guard, meaning that they are an integrated part of the coast of the Border Guard, for example, or an integrated part of the Navy, as in France, or an independent organization, as in Sweden, when we have the responsibility to coordinate all the civil requirements of maritime surveillance and the information. And normally such an organization handle law enforcement issues, security issues at sea, internal issues, rescue services, of course, crisis management, and as for the Swedish Coast Guard, also coordinating all civil requirements for maritime surveillance and information. But every country have their own solution. During the special program in the European Union called the Common Information Sharing Environment Program, it has been identified more than 300 different organizations in Europe dealing with Coast Guard functions. More or less, I would say that the core number of authorities, organizations is less than 100 in total. Many of them have common interests, of course, and many of them work together not only with Frontex, EMSA or EFCA. Many of them are very much involved also in the cooperation with the European Defence Agency or Europol, Olaf or Taxud, many different types of agencies or organizations within the European Union. And we were just talking about the international cooperation that in general is increasing. And then I need to mention also the European External Action Service, who is also a very important actor when we talk about coast guarding. And the reason for that is that shipping is international. Not many Coast Guard functions are by definition possible to talk about on only a national perspective. It's almost always so that you have international conventions, international cooperation on a global perspective, or in Europe to handle when you are a Coast Guard organization, and therefore cooperation in general is common. If we take the Baltic Sea, for example, I can mention at least 10 different organizations involved in Coast Guard functions cooperation. Baltic Sea Region Border Control Cooperation, the Helsinki Convention according to environment protection. We have the Baltic Sea Task Force Against Organized Crime in the Baltic Sea region, and so on. And knowing Coast Guard functions, knowing Coast Guarding, I can say that is the same all around the world. In the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, we have the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum, which means that we have a cooperation over the Atlantic Sea in order to cooperate better in the transatlantic area. And now latest for 2 or 3 years, I think we have 2 years ago, we have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum for the countries who are active in the Arctic region, in parallel to the Arctic Council, which also is active according to coast guarding. So this is, I wouldn't say a mess, but it's quite a lot of different organizations that are active within this area. As I said, there are many different solutions on how to carry out coast guarding. If in some countries you don't call it coast guarding either. So there are countries where they are on the paper no coast guard at all. It could be some type of maritime organization where they have a national agreement to act as a platform for the police or the customs, but there are no Coast Guard as an organization in many countries. They are either independent, as the Swedish Coast Guard, and we handle all the different Coast Guard functions, and in the National Advisory Board on Maritime Surveillance, which I'm the chairman of at the moment, we have 12 authorities that have interest in Coast Guard functions or Coast Guarding that we coordinate. I would say that 3 to 4 of them are active in this area on a daily basis. And that also goes for the military resources. We have a very close cooperation with the Navy that provide us with the situation at sea, send it to the Coast Guard. We put that together with the information needed to select objects of interest at sea. So military-civil cooperation is essential. Could also be an integrated solution where you have the border guard, for example, or the Navy, or some other organization that have the Coast Guard integrated into its organization. Or last but not least, in Europe, what we call a coordinated solution. And I would say that the Netherlands and Germany is the best examples on if you're looking for that type of organization. The Netherlands with the Coast Guard, but the board of many different authorities, or the German solution with all the authorities involved in the same command center. Also a way of coordinating the coast guarding, so to say, in the country. This introduction was meant to give you a view on how this could be solved and how different it is in many different countries, but it's always possible to handle if you establish a good cooperation, and that is what I think the challenge for Frontex, EMSA, and EFCA, and all the other authorities or agencies in Europe today. I think I stopped there, and thank you. and I hope that will be a good picture to have in mind when we to start with give Anna the floor to talk about the work, the law enforcement cooperation at sea, to introduce the concept of Coast Guard and cross-border crime detection. I would say as an end that it's, from time to time, it's easier to, within your sector, to establish international cross-border cooperation that it is to establish a cross-sectoral cooperation nationally. And it would be even more challenging to do it on a European basis. So that's all for me at the moment. And Anna, the floor is yours to talk about what you have going to do in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe I will start with some historical data. And Frontex is implementing joint operations at sea since 2006. It was not very hard to quickly understand about the quantity of entities that have roles at sea. Also about the fact that even if Frontex had a restrictive mandate, because Frontex had a mandate to, at sea, tackle irregular migration towards Europe. But we were working with authorities, national authorities, supporting member states' national authorities. Most of them had a large scope in their mandate. So when we operate in the Mediterranean with some law enforcement, they are not only competent for tackling irregular migration, they have competencies in smuggling of drugs, in environmental issues. So they had a larger mandate in this area. It was therefore easy for Frontex to identify that once we are operating with these law enforcement authorities at the sea, we cannot keep our focus only in regular migration and neglect whatever is happening in the same area where we are operating. So this was one of the findings that led us to develop our joint operations in the sense that we establish other objectives rather than just irregular migration detection. Also, we identified what you just mentioned, that different authorities have different competencies, not all the time connecting so well or networking so well when they're operating at sea. In that sense, a study was elaborated in the very beginning of Frontex, the MEDSI study, that developed into the creation of an European patrols network. This was the first attempt to make national authorities to work together, to create centers where they could share information related to what they are planning to do at sea, how they plan to operate at sea, what kind of findings they got, and also to work together with neighboring countries and also to exchange this information and experience with neighboring member states. This network is still there, and it became actually the basis for the implementation of Frontex joint operations at sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea. Things developed. Frontex started to, in its joint operations, implement cooperation with different agencies, not only at national level, but also European and international level. But this was done basically on an ad hoc basis. So it means that we were trying to streamline our cooperation with agencies like EFCA, because in fact we could support in identifying fisheries infractions also when we were at sea. We were working close also with MAOC, for instance. We had connections with different national agencies to whom we were transmitting the information of other criminality at sea when detected by our assets deployed in a certain operational area. As I said, this was done on an ad hoc basis, and the agencies on the voluntary basis were deploying or not experts to support our joint operations or to be in connection with our joint operations in order also to tackle their own interests in the same area. These things developed. As you also mentioned, another dimension is the numerous fora on Coast Guard functions that exist in Europe. Also there, Frontex has been very active. We have been supporting many initiatives developed by this Coast Guard function fora. But we have been supportive a little bit at distance. So we have been involved in some activities, training activities, some practical activities, basically the ones that relate to the mandate of the agency. This is still ongoing also with this forum, but there is definitely maybe a need to streamline and create a stronger cooperation between all these different entities. And I assume that with the migratory crisis we had in the last 2 years, with the situation that we have seen, especially in Central and Eastern Mediterranean, different actors starting different activities in the same area, there was clearly a need to streamline the cooperation. And this happened. In fact, Frontex is having not only cooperation with the same agencies that I mentioned before, but currently also with military structures that have their own operations in the same areas. We have close cooperation with Euromed for Sofia. We also have cooperation with the NATO activities in the Aegean Sea. And I think as a consequence of all this reality, there was a need to make some changes at political level. This was clearly identified by the Commission, by the Council, by the Parliament, and amendments to Frontex regulation were made. And we are now with a new mandate since October, a mandate that gives us now in the paper concrete role, concrete competencies, also when it comes to Coast Guard functions. We keep our core competence of fighting irregular migration, human smuggling, but also in general cross-border criminality and even a role in fighting terrorism. I think it was an important step. This also reflected some amendments on the two agencies that by their own nature and their own competencies, work close to Frontex in the maritime domain. And I'm talking about the Fisheries Agency and EMSA, the Maritime Safety Agency. Now it is, in fact, in the three regulations of the three agencies that there is a need to close work together in the maritime domain within their own competencies in creating synergies between European agencies in the support of the member states. And I think this was a very important step, not only for Frontex, defining that we have now a role, we can now deploy experts, so team members, also from Coast Guards. We have a clear mandate that we have a role at sea and that we have to cooperate with the member states and the other agencies in this area. I would like to refer to a pilot project on the creation of an European Coast Guard function. This pilot was already launched even before the amendments of the regulations. It was already in the beginning of 2016, and it was an initiative of the Commission to test the cooperation mechanism proposed by the Commission within the framework of the European Border and Coast Guard package. This pilot had three tasks, focusing on not only in multi-purpose, multi-agency activities, but also in capacity building, in surveillance mechanisms. And the conclusions have been presented on the 2nd of June in Lisbon. And I think this was an important step. It was a formal, important step to make the agencies look into each other and see how they can better cooperate, how they could integrate the competence of each other in their own activities and integrate elements of each other in their own operational activities. Also important to mention, it's the support that Frontex gives to the authorities that have competencies at sea, and I could refer to the two most recent operational activities we had. One implemented in the Black Sea, together with Romania, Bulgaria, and EFCA. In this particular activity, we tested the implementation of a handbook that was developed by Frontex together with the member states on boarding, but also there were some workshops for the crews focusing on boarding techniques and fisheries control. By the end of May, we also supported the European Coast Guard Function Forum and their Portuguese presidency in a big exercise that took place in Portugal, COASTEX 17. It was a major exercise where we could test several elements of the tasks that were already in the pilot. We had this big command and control surveillance center where you could see the systems of the three agencies working together with the national systems, and where you could have a clear picture of what was ongoing in the operational area under control, in the combination of information gathering, picture coming from different entities, working together in the same room and taking conclusions and decisions gathered in all this information gathering. Then at sea, we had deployment of several assets coming not only from the Portuguese authorities, but also from other member states, aerial means, surface means, and the exercise focused on the several types of possible criminality, not only the ones tackling the three agencies, but also the drug smuggling, also the boarding experience, and it was quite successful exercise that we had. And now this leads me to how should we continue? Now every agency has a clear mandate. The member states realize how the agencies can support in this area. And I think what is needed here, and now that we all have a clear role and we all have responsibilities to move forward, is that we have to streamline the cooperation at sea. We see, for instance, in the new mandate, even if Frontex was already contributing to search and rescue activities, now in the mandate it's clearly said that we have to put efforts in search and rescue. I could tell you that already in 2016, and this is not new because it comes from previous experience, Frontex was involved in the saving of more than 90,000 lives together in the two main operations, Poseidon and Triton. But also, already in 2016, we transmitted to EFCA 1,000 fishery sighting forms that could be of interest to the agency. We contributed to arrest 1,000 suspected people smugglers, to the apprehension of 96 tons of smuggled drugs. So now it's time to really formally get together, support the member states in the coordination of all the strengths, all the capacities that each entity, each authority in the member states puts at the sea. We have two levels of cooperation. We have an European international level, we have a national level, but at the end, all of them should be able to work together and be coordinated in a coherent way, because we are all doing a relevant but similar work in the maritime domain, and the more we can use the synergies, the more we can all achieve our goals and objectives. And I think now it's very clear where each one can be active in this sense, and I think this is the way now to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We continue from the European perspective to a member states example, and France, and the issue should be then added value of Frontex for law enforcement at sea on the member states' perspective. So please.
Thank you. First, I would like to highlight that there is no border at sea. You have to think there is no border at sea. There are different level of responsibility for the states, for the territorial sea to economic zone. So it's possible to throw a territorial area from a state within saying something to the state authorities. So we have to think that there is no border at sea. So it's possible to use force in all the sea under the control of a state during the approach. I have a few slides to explain the French Coast Guard function, because in France we have a Coast Guard function because we are not so old Coast Guard function than the Swedish one, but we have 7 administration we act at sea. So the Navy, the Maritime Gendarmerie, we act in the territorial water, the Gendarmerie for the search and rescue, for example, of the control of a port access, the police for the border police into the port too, the civil protection, the maritime affairs, the custom, and now we develop more and more environment officer. And we add to the administration the National Society for Safety of Life at Sea, which is a private organization. So all this administration are the Coast Guard function, which is led by the Secretary General for the Sea, not for the operation. So we give some directive to the different administration. We assume the coordination of operational watch, the information system monitoring. We provide cross-sector analysis, and we are the advisor of the Prime Minister during the crisis management. Secretary General for the Sea is the advisor for all the crisis management at sea. The Coast Guard Operational Center is under the new French MOD. So in order to have more information and to be under the protection of cyber protection of the security of the new MOD French. We are so in connected with a lot of information cell in the world, because we are an overseas territories, so we have 5 information cell in all the ocean. We coordinate with operational center of all ministry involved. And we provide requests to foreign maritime security center on the European agency at all, such example NIMIC and the new operational center in Germany of EFCA or Frontex. We have NFPOC for NCC Rossure for the Frontex. So, what is the field of interest of our Coast Guard function? So, the Crisis Maritime Response Plan, this is the first interest. Management of maritime risk for people, for environment, for goods. The safety of life at sea, search and rescue, the protection of the environment, and the law enforcement, public order, fighting against illegal activities such as during smuggling, and the protection of sovereign rights in our territory at sea, which is very huge in all the ocean. This is the problem of the Coast Guard function. So this is more easier for me. So this is the French Coast Guard function. So we have the coordination center, so in Paris, and here all the administration involved in the Coast Guard function. So I show this slide to explain you which is difficult now to build in European level. So we have this link between our center, which is the NCC Rossure, and the NFPOC is the border police in France, and we exchange information with Frontex. But also, the fishery agency in France exchange information with EFCA. The MOD exchange information with all the maritime security center in the European Union. The Navy exchange information with the European Defense Agency. The Custom exchange information with Maroc. And the civil affairs exchange information with EFCA in Europe. And of course, maritime administration exchange information with EMSA. So how to manage one network to exchange information? Because to act at sea, we have to exchange information between the member states and between all the European agencies. So we have to, I think it is one of the main challenges if to build one network, or it could be like a moderator said, it could be the CISE network. CISE network is Common Information Sharing Environment. So maybe it could be the network we need. But at the end, you need to put the member state in the center of a network. Because for the responsibility to act at sea, to make law enforcement at sea, you have to be under the member state responsibility. It's not possible to arrest a smuggler if you are under Frontex commandment. You have to be under the member state law enforcement, because we have to use force at sea. It's not possible to use force at sea if you have under Frontex. So you have to transfer the responsibility to a member state. So permanently, I think we need to have a unique system to exchange information to establish the Coast Guard function. And the second challenge, I think, we deal this morning is to develop the different options to provide the assets. So, are the assets from the government and from a member state? Is there the opportunity for Frontex to have the hand fleet? It's easy to have a hand fleet if you have some plane or some helicopter. It's always easy. But if you want to use force at sea, you have to have some assets from the member states. And I know you have different initiatives with multinational crew, with long-term deployment asset. We have to develop some asset for the Frontex to make some operation. So this is the France point of view. We support the new dynamic with mainly the free agency in European Union. This is the main thing is for since 1 year France support this dynamic. We need to detect the complex security threat at sea. So we have to act together. We have to improve the coordination. We have to support Frontex in when we want to make some joint operation. So it's a way of our country. And I think it's a real challenge to work together, and we hope to do more in the future.
Thank you. In a way, in a reflection to this, we represent two different solutions: the military solution and the civil solution. But we have the more or less the same, more or less the same challenges, so to say. You need to have the mandate, you need to have the authority, you need to have the specific training, and there is an international environment that we work in, and according to what is happening at sea, it's quite different from being onshore, because the flag state is so strong. The coastal state jurisdiction is also very strong, and that needs to be merged together in a good way. So the national legislation, the coastal states legislation jurisdiction, can be enforced by the organization that you actually have appointed for this. And maybe that will be something to elaborate from the academic point of view. You want to talk about legislation and in the future what can happen. So, Franco, please.
Thank you. Well, in my presentation, before I dealing with the content of the European Coast Guard in the new regulation, I would like to make some general comment on the new European Border and Coast Guard. Well, the regulation does not create a real European Border and Coast Guard understood as a European body replacing national border guards. As Philippe de Broecker said this morning, we are dealing with a new model built in an old logic. Therefore, Frontex is still there. I attended a conference in February organized by the Commission, and some people said, Frontex is alive. And we got this news there, that Frontex was alive. It means that, well, we have very important new elements, but we are still following the same model. Focusing on the main issue we have to deal with, the European Coast Guard is the less developed dimension of the new regulation. The European Coast Guard is functionally limited to those authorities that are competent in the field of maritime border management. In this regard, I think the regulation is ambivalent with regard to coast guarding. Firstly, during the legislative process, there was a discussion even whether to include the term Coast Guard. It was included in the first proposal launched by the Commission, later it was omitted, and finally it was included in the regulation. Secondly, the content and implication of the regulation with regard to coast guarding are not clear, in my opinion. Why? Why are not clear? Coast Guard is to a large extent only in the name. I think we have the name, but the flesh is still lacking for the reasons I'm going to explain later. For this reason, I think the title of the European Border and Coast Guard and the new agency can be misleading. We pay attention to Article 4 on the concept of the European Integrated Border Management. We only have a little reference to coast functions. Of course, we have a reference to search and rescue, but apart from that, apart from search and rescue that arise during border surveillance operation at sea, we don't see anything else. Well, we have also Article 33 that was already mentioned. This Article 33 is very important because the regulation expands the agency's power to support national authorities carrying out coast guard functions, not limited to border control. There is obviously an interesting advantage to be gained by synergies between the different authorities in the maritime environmental. Article 33 of the new regulation goes beyond strict border management and goes into cooperation with ESMA and EFCA in order to support national authorities. However, the Coast Guard functions are not defined in the regulation itself. We have a reference to Coast Guard functions only in the preamble to the regulation. And these functions are more or less the functions defined by the European Coast Guard Fora. A few months ago, the three agencies signed a tripartite working arrangement to develop further the cooperation between the three agencies in the maritime environment. As a lawyer, I think Article 53 is very problematic because it's vague. We have the same article in all three agencies' founding regulations, but no one really seems to know what it implies in practice, also for the purpose of joint operations. Can a Frontex joint operation now engage in all sorts of activities, or would it need to be a joint operation involving all three agencies? Or it is enough that Frontex coordinates an operation of national officers with competencies in all three areas covered by the respective agencies? I think these issues are not completely clear from the regulation itself. Article 33, as probably most of you know, covers Coast Guard holistically, not only border management. The regulation, as was already pointed out, provides for the sharing, parsing, and analyzing of information available to Frontex, EMSA, and EFCA. Passing information between different agencies with different mandates could be considered in itself an extension of the mandate of the agencies. This issue was well pointed out by Jordi Ridma in a study published by the European Parliament last year. Apart from that, the articles devoted to the exchange of data in the regulation don't specifically refer to EMSA or EFTA. I don't remember the article, I think it's 46 or 48. The three agencies are not mentioned as regard the exchange of data in the new regulation. This is the article which establishes clearly the framework for data protection when the exchange of data take place with other agencies. For instance, there's a clear reference to Europol, Eurojust, but nothing to EMSA or EFCA. The second issue I would like to deal with is the relation with the military. The regulation also remains unclear on the extent to which the provisions on the European Border and Coast Guard allow for the exchange of information between the member states, the agency, and the military. This is an important omission, since the military are increasingly involved in the Mediterranean and also in other areas. They are increasingly involved in search and rescue operations. I have in mind Operation Sophia, also the Aegean, the operation developed by NATO in the Aegean Sea. This is not regulated in the new regulation. Well, there's a reference in the preamble to this issue, but not clearly regulated. Some academics have already said that there's a kind of militarization of border management, in particular in the Mediterranean. I don't agree with this statement. We cannot talk of militarization of border management of sea borders. The third issue I would like to deal with is search and rescue. Fortunately, the final version of the regulation includes a reference to search and rescue, and makes clear that the agency can provide technical and operational assistance to member states and third states in support on search and rescue. The attribution of such a task to the European Border and Coast Guard would also do justice to the practical reality in which many maritime border operations sooner or later become SAR operations. However, provisions on SAR activities have proven controversial, as could already been seen in the negotiations on the guidelines for Frontex coordinating joint operations at sea of 2014, and also on the Eurosur system. I wonder whether the EU should adopt SAR rules regulating SAR operations. There's an issue that could arrive in practice. It could happen that a vessel of a member state should be subjected to stricter rules when it is deployed within a Frontex operation. It has to fully respect the principle of non-refoulement, while the same vessel, if it is deployed under another international organization or within a national operation, could informally undertake pushbacks. One may wonder also if the limitation of the scope of the current rules on surveillance of the external sea borders still remains after the creation of the European Border and Coast Guard. As you already know, the regulation establishes a shared responsibility in the management of the external borders. In such scenario, limiting the application of uniform rules on intersection and SAR to Frontex operation only become even less acceptable. We have to move forward towards common rules on SAR operations. Now, finally, what will be the ideal scenario? As it has been pointed out by the previous speakers, we have more than 300 authorities operating at sea. We can talk about a multi-actor landscape at sea. I was involved in the task force, in the CEPS task force, on how to further develop the European Border and Coast Guard in the future. And we arrived to the following conclusions. I think we need to go to a scenario where there's the link between asylum responsibilities and SAR operations, because nowadays there's a clear link. When you rescue people at sea, you have to deal with their applications for asylum. In this CEPS document, the two main ideas were proposed. The first one is to further develop in practice the mandates of Frontex and also EASO, to expand the reach of their competencies in sharing responsibility with national authorities. For instance, without any treaty change, the scope and thematic priorities of Frontex sea operations could be enlarged to cover SAR operations. In this paper, it is proposed to move towards a hybrid model of responsibility as regards SAR operations. And Frontex will act as a kind of coordinator of the national authorities. Of course, we need a political compromise at high level to move towards this proposal. And the second main idea presented in this document is to move towards a European Border and Asylum Service. This morning, in the plenary session, some of the speakers talk about that. And of course, I think in the long run, we should move towards a kind of federalization in border management. Of course, it's not the ideal solution, a centralization, but the ideal solution would be a kind of federalization of border management in the European Union. It should come also with a kind of federalization in asylum responsibilities, in the sense that more solidarity is needed to share the responsibility to deal with asylum applications. In conclusion, in the future, asylum and border management at political level should be further developed together. They cannot be considered issues completely separated. They have to be clearly linked at political level.
Thank you for that, and I would say quite a lot of different questions raised that needs to be handled in the future, in the future development of European Coast Guard functions. We are not creating a European Coast Guard. We are creating a Coast Guard function, and it could be quite difficult to understand. If I understood you correctly, it's also so that you always need to rely on your national legislation when you appoint responsible authorities, even if they worked in an operation coordinated by European Union agencies or whatever. Coming back to that, in the flag state, coastal state jurisdiction, port state jurisdiction, and so on. But you have heard our presentations. I assume they raised also questions for you in the audience. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Let's see who will start. Okay. I think there is. Otherwise, you can have mine.
Yeah, so thank you. My name is Kristinsson from Icelandic Coast Guard. regarding the special regulation for search and rescue in the Schengen area or in the European Union zone. Now we are operating in accordance with the EMSA manual, the International Aeronautical and Maritime Search and Rescue Manual. Are we missing something there? Is the EMSA manual not enough to operate from? Why do we need special regulation for search and rescue in the European area?
Would like to? Okay.
There is no European space at sea. There is only a member state space at sea. So you need in each member state space at sea to have their own regulation. So it's not possible to have the same regulation in all the member state space at sea. We have an international UNCLOS convention where you have a convention of, for example, Vienna Convention for the drug smuggling, but each member state have a view of how to use this convention to make the law enforcement at sea. So it's not possible to have the same regulation at sea for law enforcement. It's very difficult. But if you put your assets under the control of Frontex, maybe to make some search and rescue operation in the central Mediterranean Sea, if your assets maybe cross a smuggler or armed trafficker, is possible to switch to the member state control and to make the operation under to use force under the member state responsibility, and after you switch to Frontex.
Okay, I think Anna would
it's
like
because
to say
it's because we call this Coast Guard function.
Yes, Anna.
Thank you. I think what triggered your question was some statement from our colleague academic. And in fact, at this point, we could have, for instance, in Central Mediterranean, different rules applying depending on who's doing search and rescue. There is a concrete regulation that applies only for Frontex joint operations when operating at sea, with clear rules about how to deal with rescued persons. And this regulation only applies to the assets that are involved in the Frontex joint operation. So next to, you can have, for instance, the Italian assets operating in the same area, but which are not binded by this specific regulation. You have the militaries also operating in the same area, which are also not obliged to follow the rules in this regulation. And I think this is what triggered the issue. I'm not sure if we should have a regulation or common rules in Europe about search and rescue, because it's an area that it's internationally wise, very well regulated. But the fact is that currently we have a specific regulation that makes joint operations conducted by Frontex and respective assets, it makes them deal differently or eventually differently from other assets operating in same area doing the same business.
But I think, just to add, and you will I hope you can answer this also. The very special situation in the Mediterranean is, from my perspective, is that the facilitators actually uses this international regulation on search and rescue at sea. Everyone is obliged to act if something happens, and so what they are doing actually is that the facilitators that they are arranged with the search and rescue situation in order to be handled by the border control agencies, the navies operating in the area, and all the others also, of course. And that's normal business for a Coast Guard organization, of course. But it complicates the situation that they actually are using international legislation when you are obliged to act. Can you elaborate on that a bit, maybe?
At the international level, it's quite clear. We have several conventions, mainly SOLAN, so to deal with search and rescue. And what I said is that, as Anna pointed out, there are several actors carrying out search and rescue in the Mediterranean. When Frontex gets involved in SAR, there are very clear rules developed at the European level. I remember when 2014 regulation was adopted, member states were very, very reluctant to this new regulation because they didn't want to get any new rule arising from EU level as regards SAR. I think once the new agency gets more and more involved in border management and in other activities at sea, we would need something else. Because as I said before, perhaps a boat, a vessel operating under NATO or under EU military operation would have to follow not different rules because they are established at international law, but in the case of sea Frontex operations, there are very detailed rules in 2014 regulation. Another issue is that, for instance, when Mare Nostrum ended, there was a gap. There was a gap in the Mediterranean because Triton couldn't go as far as Mare Nostrum. This issue brings to my mind another issue that some people said that Mare Nostrum had a calling effect on migrants and asylum seekers. It has been clearly demonstrated that it's not like this because the number of people arriving by sea to the EU has continuously increased. So, in my opinion, these SAR operations don't have in practice a calling effect.
Okay, much can be said about this, I think, and what is obvious for a Coast Guard officer and a Navy officer also is according to the national legislation and the responsibility by the country involved, you need at least standard operational procedures for those involved in such an operation. But that's quite a different thing, I would say. And you have that around your waters around Iceland also. So that's the difference between legislation and agreed standard operational procedures, how to act when something happens. Is there other issue? Yeah, we have another question here.
Thank you. My name is Murad Nagiyev. I am Colonel of the State Border Service of Azerbaijan Republic. In our country, State Border Service is part, it's a unique organization which provides border security and border protection and subordinated directly to the President of the country. And Coast Guard is the part of the State Border Service. In your statements, you mentioned the different tasks of the European Coast Guard authorities, such as fighting against illegal migration, search and rescue, risk analysis, and other activities. And what do you think about the provide of the security of the critical maritime infrastructure? And how is the new Frontex regulation describe these activities? Maybe you have some future plans of the Frontex activities regarding this issue. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to answer that or try to answer that?
I didn't understand well the military. What was the question?
Can you develop it a bit?
Providing security of the critical maritime infrastructure. I mean that's the when we're talking about the critical infrastructure, we mean that infrastructure related with some kind of the supply energy resources from one part world to the another. Oil and gas pipelines, oil platforms, offshore platforms, oil and gas fields, all this.
Well, this kind of function has very little to do with Frontex mandate. Well, if the cooperation between the three agencies develop further in the future, perhaps indirectly Frontex operations could get involved in this issue. But as I understand the current regulation, it has very little to do with Frontex mandate.
Yeah, indeed. There is no concrete role for Frontex related to the new regulation on these issues, and there is no objective, at least in the midterm period, to tackle or focus in such type of prevention or protection of infrastructure. Of course, as I said, when Frontex has an operation in the maritime domain and whatever type of criminal activities is detected, we have the obligation to transfer information to competent authorities. But at this point, there is nothing there for Frontex.
You always should be ready because it's one of the targets of the future terrorist attacks.
As a Coast Guard organization, I can understand your question, because that's a multitasking thinking that you should have. It's not for Frontex. EMSA could be involved, maybe more of civil protection issues. Back home, it would be the Maritime Administration and Transport Agency and some other agencies also. But it's still a Coast Guard issue if you are a multitasking organization. So I can understand your question, but we are not there yet. Maybe we'll be there in the future when the cooperation between the different agencies increases. Any French thoughts about that?
No, just in terms of maritime surveillance, because we could improve exchange of information with you. And now, for example, in Mediterranean Sea, is it now possible to observe all the assets by satellite, to exchange all the information, to analyze this information? So it's possible to exchange information with you from our Coast Guard information center. It's not a problem.
Okay, soon it will be lunch. I'm not going to wrap this up now. We'll do it later on during the discussions in the plenary. But one can conclude, I think, from this discussion that national legislation is still very important. Most of the different for us that the Swedish Coast Guard and our colleagues, in the Nordic colleagues, the colleagues in the Baltic Sea and even in the Mediterranean, are built upon the fact that we cooperate within the frames of the national legislation. National legislation gives us the authority as Coast Guards. Coast Guard functions. This I know it's not the same as the police, the customs, the military armed forces, and so on. There are no definition on what a Coast Guard or a Coast Guard function is. It's very much relying on the national legislation that gives the mandate and gives the authority. And then, according to the people that we meet out there, a vessel is never a criminal. It's maybe the people on board or the people who have launched the container, for example. The difference between the maritime situational awareness and the maritime domain awareness, to actually know what's loaded in Chicago and reach the goal in Reykjavik later on. it's not only the situation at sea. It's not only the flag state. It's not only the coastal state or the port state that you need to handle. It's also the people on board who could be of many different nationalities. The crew could be a multinational crew. There could be very many different owners of the cargo. Could be insured in many different companies, and so on and so on. Quite a complex picture. And from time to time, back home at least, we ask ourselves, how much can you get into a head of a Coast Guard officer? And that will be, I think, the challenge in the future. How far can you get in this cooperation, even in Europe? Someone else who would like to give a final comment from the audience? Then I thank you for listening to us and good questions, and have a good lunch, and see you later.